The next crack in the American economy is not going to begin with a polished press release from Wall Street. It is going to begin in driveways. It is going to begin in parking lots. It is going to begin in tow yards, missed payments, silent shame, delayed phone calls, and in the exhausted arithmetic of households that are still trying to carry loans written during a period when prices lost contact with reality. That is what most people still do not understand. They think a financial crisis begins when the famous people say the word crisis. It does not. A real crisis begins much earlier, in the years when ordinary people are forced to finance ordinary life on terms that would have sounded insane in a healthier system, and those terms are then defended as normal because too many institutions now depend on pretending they are normal. That is where the danger sits in the car market right now, not simply in delinquency, in normalization. People are being trained to see things that should shock them and call them Standard 7. Year loans on depreciating vehicles, borrowing well above the value of a used car, consumers already drowning in negative equity being offered longer terms instead of lower prices. Lenders acting as though the solution to unaffordable transportation is not to correct the price of the asset, but to stretch the duration of the pain. This is not a healthy market adjusting. This is a weak market disguising stress with time. That is the first thing I would want you to understand. The car is not the story. The car is the collateral. The real story is the consumer. And the consumer, at this point, is being asked to survive a cost structure that no longer fits the income structure beneath it. When that happens, finance always does the same thing. It starts by pretending the problem is monthly affordability. If the payment is too high, extend the term. If the credit profile is weak, find a way to massage the file. If the collateral is overpriced, lend against it anyway. If the borrower is already too stretched, hope that time, inflation, or desperation will somehow do the work that honest underwriting no longer can. That is how systems rot, not with one grand lie. With many small extensions of the same lie. This is the first mechanism. I call it the extend and pretend loop. The extend. Pretend loop is what happens when lenders, dealers, finance companies, and the wider market confront a simple truth they do not want to absorb. The asset is too expensive for the buyer. In a sound system, that truth would force a repricing. The car would need to get cheaper, or the lender would say no, or the borrower would walk away. But in a stress system, everyone has a reason to avoid that conclusion. Dealers want the sale. Lenders want the interest stream. Securitization channels want volume. Consumers want transportation and the illusion of continuity. So instead of repricing the truth, the system extends the fiction. 84 months longer approvals, higher loan to value, more tolerance, more we can make this work. And every one of those phrases sounds constructive until you realize what is really happening. The market is not solving affordability. It is financing unaffordability. That distinction matters because unaffordability financed over a longer period does not become health. It becomes fragility with paperwork. The borrower gets the keys. Yes, the dealership books the sale. Yes, the bank records the loan. Yes, everyone in the chain gets to behave as if a real economic solution occurred. But the balance sheet knows better. The borrower has not become richer. The vehicle has not become more durable. The income stream has not become more stable. The car has simply been wrapped in enough duration that the crisis feels delayed. Delayed is not the same thing as avoided. In fact, delayed pain is usually worse because by the time it arrives, more people have built plans around the assumption that it would not. This is why the used car loan to value issue matters so much. Once you begin writing loans far above the actual value of the collateral, you are no longer just financing transportation. You are financing a gap between what something is worth and what someone wishes it were worth. That gap then sits on the consumer's back. The lender can pretend to have an asset-backed loan. The dealer can pretend the market price was legitimate. The consumer can pretend the purchase was manageable. But the first time the car needs major repairs, the first time income slips, the first time a refinance window closes, the truth returns. The truth is that a depreciating machine was bought with borrowed money in a structure that almost guarantees the borrower will spend a long time underwater. That is the second mechanism. I call it the negative equity trap. The negative equity trap is what happens when the debt on the car falls more slowly than the value of the car itself. This is not a side effect. It is the central disease. Cars are not productive assets in the way people like to fantasize. A car is not a house. It does not sit still while society inflates around it. It decays, it wears, it ages, it gets scratched, crashed, stolen from, neglected, and eventually discarded. It loses economic dignity very quickly. That is why financing one over too long a term is so dangerous. The borrower is not climbing toward ownership. The borrower is sliding down a slope while chained to the top of it. The reason this became so poisonous after the pandemic years is obvious if you are willing to look straight at the numbers and the behavior. Prices spiked. Supply was constrained. Dealers added markups that would have been laughable in calmer years. Buyers were panicked, delayed, or desperate. A great many people bought cars not at reasonable valuations but at fever valuations. And because the monthly payment culture dominates American consumer finance, a huge share of those buyers did not ask the adult question, what is this car actually worth? They asked the child question the system trains them to ask, can I make the monthly payment? That is the psychology that allows bubbles in everyday necessities. Once a society thinks in payments rather than prices, it becomes much easier to overcharge for the asset itself. Because if the lender will stretch the term and the buyer only measures the pain monthly, the market can carry a ridiculous sticker price much longer than it should. That is not just a car story. That is a civilizational story. It shows you how a society in which wages are weak and prices are high can continue functioning long after the underlying economics stop making sense. You no longer sell reality, you sell the installment version of fantasy. This is the third mechanism. I call it the payment illusion. The payment illusion is the substitution of monthly tolerability for real affordability. It is one of the most destructive ideas in the entire consumer economy because it allows asset prices to become detached from value without forcing an immediate social correction. The buyer does not say, this $50,000 vehicle is absurd. The buyer says, can I survive $812 a month? The dealer does not say, this asset is overpriced. The dealer says, let's see what term gets the payment down. The bank does not say, the borrower is taking too much risk on a wasting asset. The bank says, can the file pass under extended assumptions? In other words, everyone stops thinking in price and starts thinking in pain management. That is how bubbles seep into ordinary life. And it is exactly why the auto market matters so much. Cars are not luxury side stories in the American economy. For millions of households, the car is the bridge to work, childcare, medical care, food, family, and ordinary dignity. When the financing behind that bridge becomes toxic, the problem is never confined to the car lot. It spreads outward. The borrower struggling with a car payment is not just struggling with a vehicle. He is struggling with the hidden tax of participation in normal life. This is why delinquency is a much more serious signal than people appreciate. Delinquency in auto loans is not just a finance statistic, it is one of the clearest signals that the consumer S buffer is gone. A household will usually let many other things slide before it lets the car go, because the car is how the household remains economically visible. Once car debt starts breaking at scale, it means the pressure has moved past embarrassment and into infrastructure. That is when I become interested. Because financial markets love to ignore signals from the bottom of the system until the bottom forces the top to notice. Now think about what is being described in the source document you gave me. A market in which serious delinquencies are already elevated. A market in which some lenders appear more interested in postponing repossession than in resolving the underlying problem. A market in which fraud is rising because desperate borrowers and shady intermediaries can use modern tools to temporarily manufacture eligibility. A market in which extended terms are no longer a quirky exception, but a normalized way of forcing broken affordability into a saleable monthly shape. A market in which losses are being provisioned for because the institutions themselves know more pain is coming than the public conversation admits. That last part is important. When institutions start increasing reserves for loan losses, you should listen harder than when they make optimistic public statements. Public language is management. Reserves are confession. This is the fourth mechanism. I call it the quiet confession. The quiet confession is what institutions reveal through provisioning, underwriting changes, term extensions, and servicing behavior. Long before they say the scary words out loud, a bank or finance company can tell you that the economy is resilient, that credit remains strong, that demand remains healthy, that the consumer is still engaged, fine. Then ask a ruder question. What are they doing with reserves? What kind of loans are they writing? What term lengths are becoming normal? What collateral assumptions are being made? What percentage of the market now requires stretched structures just to stay liquid? That is where the truth lives. Because the truth in financial systems usually appears first in accommodations. Before you see the default wave plainly, you see the architecture being adjusted to delay recognition of it. More patience, more workouts, more calls, more exemptions, more we willing to work with you. That sounds humane, and some of it may be humane, but structurally it also performs another function. It smooths the visible data. It keeps the repo crisis from appearing all at once. It prevents the market from fully clearing. It allows asset prices and credit books to avoid immediate confrontation with the truth. That smoothing is politically convenient. It is also economically dangerous. This is why I do not take comfort from the fact that everything has not yet hit the tape in a dramatic way. What matters is not whether the formal repo crisis has been fully counted. What matters is whether the system is already being bent to postpone recognizing losses it knows are there. If the answer is yes, then you are no longer in a clean market, you are in an administered market. That brings us to repossession itself. Most people think repos are the disaster. They are wrong. Repos are the recognition of the disaster. The disaster happened earlier, when a household with weak finances was allowed or encouraged to finance too much car at too much duration against too much depreciation. The repossession is merely the moment the music finally stops and the paperwork catches up to reality. That is why the shortage of repo capacity, the delays, the backlog, and the slow motion handling of bad paper matter so much. They do not disprove the crisis. They distort the timing of when the crisis becomes obvious. This is the fifth mechanism. I call it the recognition lag. The recognition lag is the delay between when losses are economically real and when they are operationally recognized. In the meantime, the market keeps functioning on a false calm. Buyers keep buying, lenders keep lending, analysts keep smoothing, the public keeps assuming the numbers describe the whole wound. But if repos are delayed, if borrowers are being gently floated, if servicers are reluctant to pull the trigger, if the used car market cannot absorb the losses cleanly, then the system is storing up an uglier future adjustment. That is not stability. That is damage in queue. Now we have to talk about fraud, because fraud is always one of the clearest signs that a market's moral and financial structure has weakened. Fraud rises when desperation meets permissive institutions. It rises when the incentive to get the deal done becomes stronger than the incentive to preserve underwriting integrity. It rises when technology lowers the cost of deception, and it rises most aggressively in markets where everyone knows that if the deal does not happen, the whole chain below it may have to admit something uncomfortable. The emergence of credit manipulation, synthetic improvements in borrower appearance, AI-assisted dispute gaming, and other forms of eligibility distortion is not just a criminal sideshow, it is a stress signal. It tells you that there are enough people who need the loan, enough intermediaries who need the volume, and enough holes in the process that fake creditworthiness can become a viable bridge into an otherwise inaccessible transaction. That is not bullish. That is a moral breakdown caused by pricing and income pressure. This is the sixth mechanism. I call it the desperation fraud loop. The desperation fraud loop appears when a system becomes so stretched that both borrowers and institutions are tempted to collude directly or indirectly. In a fiction, the borrower wants the car, the dealer wants the sale, the lender wants the yield. The bureau process is slow enough to be gamed. The technology to automate deception gets cheaper. The social shame around being unable to secure transportation is high. The result is predictable. Fraud stops being a weird outlier and starts becoming a rational response inside a system that has made honest affordability too rare. That is why I do not see this as merely a used car market issue. It is an American household balance sheet issue. A consumer who gets trapped in an impossible car loan is not just making one bad decision. That consumer is revealing the condition of the broader economy. The household lacks buffer. Transportation is non-negotiable. The pricing of basic mobility has outrun what the household can sanely support. Credit is being used as a prosthetic for income. That is the key. Credit is being asked to perform the work that wages, prices, and social structure fail to perform. And credit cannot do that forever. Eventually, it turns on the user. This is why the auto market can become such a powerful macro signal. It sits at the intersection of labor, household cash flow, manufacturing, used asset pricing, banking, shadow finance, consumer psychology, and the politics of ordinary life. If housing was the great long-duration consumer trap of one era, auto debt is one of the most revealing medium-duration traps of this one. It is easier to ignore politically because each loan is smaller. That makes it no less serious socially. In some ways, it is more serious because the car is closer to everyday necessity. Now let us talk about the danger zone around month 42 or thereabouts, the kind of time frame mentioned in the document you gave me. What makes that stage so toxic is that it arrives after the borrower has already eaten the initial depreciation, already paid a great deal of interest, already carried the psychological burden of the debt for years, and often still remains deeply underwater or financially strained. The household begins asking a very dark question around that point. Why am I still suffering for an asset that no longer justifies the burden? That question is where defaults are born, not only because the borrower cannot pay, because the borrower eventually stops believing the sacrifice is rational. This is the seventh mechanism. I call it the abandonment threshold. The abandonment threshold is the point at which continued payment feels less like ownership and more like hostage behavior. It is one thing to carry a large mortgage on an appreciating or at least durable asset. It is another to keep feeding a wasting machine that no longer reflects the debt attached to it, while the family budget is being squeezed by everything else at the same time. Once the emotional logic of the payment breaks, default risk jumps. The borrower may not announce it that way, but the behavior changes, the call gets delayed. The payment gets skipped, the car gets neglected, the relationship with the debt becomes adversarial. That is when the lender discovers that collateral quality matters after all. And collateral quality in repos is an ugly subject, because lenders do not repo pristine museum pieces. They often repo stressed, damaged, neglected, cosmetically abused, mechanically uncertain vehicles recovered from households under severe pressure, which means the loss is not just about paper equity, it is about the condition gap between the financial model and the real object dragged back into the system. This is why increased loan loss reserves are so telling. They are not abstract. They are the arithmetic recognition that what comes back may be worth far less than what the books once hoped. So where does this go next? First, tighter lending, not because institutions suddenly become wise, but because losses force memory on them. When lenders get hurt, they rediscover standards. Unfortunately, they often rediscover them too late, after the pain has already spread to the people least able to absorb another tightening. Second, weaker consumer mobility. If more borrowers carry repos, damaged credit, or chronic negative equity, then their future options shrink. The car market stops being a ladder and becomes a trap. They cannot upgrade cleanly. They cannot refinance cleanly. They cannot re-enter prime credit channels cleanly. They become more economically fragile, not just for 1 year, but for many. Third, knock-on pressure for related businesses. Used car inventories, auctions, independent dealers, finance arms, repair shops, insurers. Everyone gets touched by a change in how quickly cars cycle through the system and how healthy the customer base remains. A stressed financing market changes the whole ecosystem. Fourth, the larger signal to the economy, if the average consumer is now being held together by longer terms, higher LTVs, delayed repos, fraud creep, and worsening delinquency in something as basic as transportation, then the U.S. economy is not healthier than it looks. It is weaker than the polished surface suggests. That is the real warning, not merely that auto loans are ugly. That the consumer, as margin of safety, is much thinner than the official story. Likes to admit this is the eighth mechanism. I call it the consumer canary. The consumer canary is the sector that reveals systemic weakness earlier, because it sits closest to daily necessity and daily cash flow. Cars are perfect for this role. Households can postpone many purchases. They can cut vacations, clothing, gifts, furniture, gadgets, and even healthcare for a while. But transportation pressure eventually forces the truth. If people cannot sustain the debt on the thing that gets them to work, then the problem is not cosmetic. The canary is already on the floor. That is why I think the next few years in the car market matter so much more than they appear to. They are not simply about repos, loan terms, or dealership behavior. They are about whether the American consumer has enough real income left to carry a normal life without being propped up by increasingly distorted credit structures. If the answer is no, then something larger is coming. Because economies built on stretched consumers can keep moving for a while, they can even look healthy for stretches. But once the stress begins breaking through in necessities, once the debt structures around necessities begin mutating into obviously unhealthy forms, once the institutions themselves begin provisioning for pain while still publicly selling normality, you are no longer looking at a sector story. You are looking at a warning shot. So no, I do not think the right way to read this is panic. The right way to read it is diagnosis. The diagnosis is that the system is not repricing the car to fit the consumer. It is repricing time, dignity, and future flexibility to keep the sale alive. That is a very different and much uglier kind of adjustment. And it is why the next financial stress in America may show up first, not in a hedge fund letter, not in a CNBC graphic, not in a Fed speech, but in a much quieter place. A borrower 3.5 years into a bad deal, looking at a car that is worth far less than the debt attached to it, and deciding that the sacrifice no longer makes sense. When enough of those decisions arrive together, the economists will call it a consumer slowdown, the lenders will call it credit deterioration, and the politicians will act surprised. But the truth will be simpler than all of that. The crisis began years earlier, when the country decided that instead of making cars affordable again, it would make denial last longer.